Hey, what's up, guys? This is DeathGroundReviews. Like to welcome you all today. I've got with me again Rami Ungar. Welcome, Rami.
Hello, boys and girls. I'm Rami Wisden, dancing author. And you'll float too. You'll float too. You can't tell because the Death Ground Reviews uses stills from movies and from like book covers, but I'm holding a Pennywise the Clown doll from the second movie while doing an impression of him.
Rami right now is possessed by it. And so my worst nightmares could be coming true in this very episode, guys. So,
There are going to be leeches in your bathtub. I
yes.
assume that's one of your nightmares.
Oh, I've got plenty of nightmares. You can find them in my stories. They show up there in various forms. But yes, today we are discussing
Indeed,
Stephen King's It.
they do.
And I'm going to start us off with a synopsis here. Not that it really needs one. I'm sure most horror fans know of this story, but this is kind of one of King's, sci-fi fantasy type horror stories. It tells the story of an alien life form that comes to Earth and it takes the form of whatever its victims are afraid of. It can take the form of a mummy, a werewolf, vampire, etc. And then it gobbles them up in this form. And it repeats this cycle every 27 years. Well, in 1958, this cycle is interrupted when this coalition of kids, they call themselves the Losers Club, they team up and manage to temporarily beat it. And then they forget it all happened. Years go by, they grow up, they become successful in careers, get married, become adults, essentially. And 1985 rolls around, and similar problems start stirring up in the town of Derry, Maine. Mike Hanlon, he's sort of the sentinel, that's been waiting there and watching. He calls them all back up, and they have to return again and make a stand. And I want to mention too, the structure of the novel, it leaps back and forth between 1985 and 1958. King mentioned that it was hard writing this book. Like he said, not just because of the length. I mean, it is like 1,138 pages long, but he says just trying to
Hmm.
remember his childhood. He's like, it was so hard to remember. And he kind of had to get in the semi dreaming state to remember. And the more he wrote, the more these memories rushed back to his mind. And for me, kind of the beating heart of the book is King almost making a last grasp at childhood in a sense, as that monster of time kind of swallows it all up. He's almost trying to hold on to those, I guess, idealized elements, the ability to believe, the that inexhaustible energy from that time. Yeah, what do you think, Rami?
Well, I don't. A dream state, huh? I wonder what drugs he was using to achieve that. Uh,
I think maybe it was just the process of getting in writing mode, and then the more you're
hmm.
doing it, the more writing's almost like this meditation in a sense. And I think just the more he was writing, the more his mind was reaching to that subterranean place.
Well, what you said about grasping childhood and about recreating his childhood, I think he did a very good job. I mean, he was it when I reread it earlier this year. This would have been about March, April-ish. It took me over a month to get through the audiobook. I realized that King is the same age as the characters when the first cycle happened, and he's the same age as the characters when the second cycle happened. So it's very personal for him. He's drawing from both what was then contemporary experience as well as memory, and he does a very good job of bringing you into the mind of a child, both and into an adult.
It's I was reading Grady Hendrix's review on the book, and he mentions that one of the weaknesses of the book is that King depicts an overly nostalgic, kind of idealized version of childhood. Oh, he says these kids
Mm.
are almost too good. They're not realistic. They're they're too brave, they're too loyal, he says he's writing about the way we wish we could have been as kids. But then he
Well,
says simultaneously it's the strength of the book too, in a way. But
well, to Grady Hendrix's credit, when it was being written, and there was 50s nostalgia, like we have 80s nostalgia today. The um that being said, I thought it was a pretty not unglamorous view of things. I mean, yeah, there's the folksy, oh, it's the 50s. We got nice clean cars and suburbia, and all these fancy new gadgets and television and 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 characters like Rocket Racer or Little Lulu and whatever. And but there at the same time you got communist fears, racism. Um, at one point, Richie Tozier, before he tries to comfort Bill, because Bill's is having a bit of a breakdown over the death of his brother, he looks around just to make sure nobody would call them a couple of queers. Homophobia was a really big thing back then. I mean, it still is now, but it was even bigger then. It was very dangerous, much more dangerous to be homosexual or be perceived as homosexual then. And I don't think the kids are idealized at all. Think I mean, yeah, they're good kids, but they're also outsiders, and they're also very well acquainted with pain. I mean, Bill is angry about not just losing his brother, but about how his parents are basically neglecting them to wallow in their own grief. Uh, Richie is basically ADHD before it was ever or named as such. I'm pretty sure I saw my own ADHD is in 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 him, especially with his more wild behavior. I'm honestly surprised I did not see it before. And my Beverly, he had faces abuse at home and isolating loneliness at school. Well, Ben Hanscom is basically being fattened up by his mother and and gets poked fun at all the time. He, I don't see idealized kids. Mike Hanlon has to deal with racism just because he's like the only black kid in town. Oh, and Andy Caspra like, is basically being abused by his mother, so she has someone to pay attention to her.
it's a good summary there. So yeah, they
Thank
do
you.
have these contradictions. They do have all these flaws
The
that
only
make them out.
character, the only character I really don't like is Stan Uris. And
Really?
not Yeah, I'm Jewish. Let me put that out there first. I'm
Okay.
Jewish.
Okay.
And I've always had a problem with how Stan is depicted. Look, I love the novel and I love how he was sort of redeemed in the movies.
So there's something there that was unrealistic to like your beliefs. What is it that you found dislikable about Stan Uris?
It's hard to put into words, which is hilarious considering I'm an author, but it I just felt like it wasn't like it was more of a certain stereotype of a Jew who,
Mhm.
who and I did not like how he was so who like obsessed with order and cleanliness and having a solid worldview. And I just felt he wasn't really realistic, at least not to the Jewish kids I know. And I've known plenty of different Jewish kids. I've met those that are religious, I've met those that aren't. And I've met secular kids, I've met Israeli kids, I've met all sorts of Jewish kids. And he did this felt like an idea of a Jewish grown-up created by a non-Jew, but but de-aged.
Did you feel it kind of fit Grady's description? Did King idealize any elements of the Jewish element in that character in a way that you
Honestly,
thought was unrealistic?
honestly, sometimes from the Jewish, I've read a lot of King's work, and sometimes he gets the Jewish characters right. I mean, like in the Langoliers, the young violinist character who ends up making out with a teenage girl. Well, at the end, he felt like some people I know. Oh, but Stan, I feel like he missed the mark. I feel like he stands more of a cardboard cutout than an actual fully realized character. I mean, there are moments where he does show some character, but it like I said, it's more of a cardboard cutout. So I really do love how he's portrayed in the movie versions. Like he's in the movie versions, he's a rabbi's son. So there's a which I emphasize with both my parents are rabbis, and yeah, it wasn't always easy, especially when preparing for my bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
Um, I liked how he was at least he's willing to acknowledge that weird shit was going on and didn't like, I'm going to deny it because I hate that kind of stuff. And how he wasn't like super obsessed with cleanliness. And I love how, spoiler alert for a movie that came out in 2019 and for a book that came out in 1986. But I loved how his suicide was framed as an act of strengthening. I mean, in the book, it's kind of portrayed as cowardice. Like he's so scared of facing it in its real form, as well as what it is creating in its den.
See,
In
for
its
me, that scene was one of the most chilling scenes for me when I read the book, that his suicide scene. You know,
the way
that
they
like that line where he says the turtle couldn't help us. You know, he whispers that to himself in that
yeah
kind of
they
dazed, confused state. Man, that scene gave me chills. And then, you know, the it written in blood on the side of the bathtub wall. That was a scary
and
scene for me.
I totally forgot about how much Stan seemed to remember or sensing things. It's kind of hinted that he was affected differently. However, or what But yeah, it's chilling, but they portrayed it as like he did not want to get himself dirty. He did not want to dirty himself with going down and facing it one more time. Whereas in the movies, it's portrayed as an act of strengthening. He literally says in his letter, which he mails to everyone, and I did this because I knew if I came, we would all fail. Well, I would be too weak to stand beside you. I would lead to our deaths. So I did the only logical thing. I took myself off the board. Honestly, I'm
Well,
not a
it's kind
fan
of
of
a
suit.
martyr's. It's kind of a martyr's death in
And
this in a way.
and it worked. Bill Hader playing Richie Tozier finds the old synagogue. Remember, there's Stan's bar mitzvah speech and finds the power to stay and fight Pennywise when he's really thinking about bailing. That martyrdom redeems Stan, and I love it.
Interesting. You know, it makes me wonder, like, how much maybe King influenced that. Maybe he reflected on his book, thinking, "Oh, I wish I had written that different," and then maybe emphasize that to the script writers. I don't know.
That might be the case. I mean, in the book, at the end of it, they start to forget. In the movie, though, they're allowed to keep their memories because this time they're actually proud of what they've done. And they finally managed to defeat it. But in the book, every time their memories fade as soon as their mission is done and they start to leave Derry.
Right. And I guess that's symbolic of just how quick childhood goes away, how quick it
Tell me about
disappears.
it.
But
Yeah.
Some stuff we said here brought to my mind a few things. It brings to my mind that line that Charles Dickens wrote. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love that line.
Oh
Best
yeah.
opening ever.
And you can apply that to like any time period, but when you were talking about the 1950s, you had all those gleaming things going on, the shiny cars, the economy, all that stuff, the culture that was developing, but then all the ugly, worse things underneath it in that those sewers, right? That's
Yeah.
what those sewers symbolize throughout the book. But it made me think as well of there's a line I want to quote real quick, and then I'll get to my point. From the book, there's this line that says, "You pay for what you get, you own what you pay for, and sooner or later, whatever you own comes back home to you."
Hmm.
And it just made me think about all those like unresolved. There's another line that says, "Sometimes they come back," too, that was associated with that quote. All those things in childhood, those unresolved traumas, those unresolved fears, unresolved flaws, all those things, they always kind of stay there, buried in the sewers of our mind. But then sooner or later, they come back up. They flush back up again, and you have to face them. You have to confront them. And for me, that's kind of also what this whole book's about. All these kids in the Losers Club, they all have their fear, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
Eddie had his hypochondriac mom who kind of affects him in a similar paranoid way. Beverly with her abusive father, et cetera, et cetera. Bill and is struggling with his stutter, and the death of his brother, of course, and his parents neglecting him, and the disintegration of their family unit. And yeah, and in their older years, they finally not only do they face the monster, that representation of all fear, but they're facing the monstrous fears within their own minds, sewers of their own minds, in a sense.
Except for maybe Stan. And
Except for maybe Stan. His wasn't fully emphasized, was it? His fear.
he was a it was. Um it was. He hates the idea that the world's not a solid place of atoms
Oh,
and
right, right.
electrical
Okay.
bonds. I mean,
Yeah.
he in the book, Bill has to literally tell him, yes, yes, this is happening. Stop trying to deny it by closing Mike's photo album. Yes, this is happening. Stop denying reality. He, but I was gonna say, Stan's in his memories, his trauma, it never went down into the sewers of his mind.
Never
You
confronted
can,
it. And maybe that's what led to that weakness when he was older. In the moment
mm,
of suicide, was his unwillingness to confront that in a way. I don't know. It's good. What's interesting too is later, it wasn't it Stan that led the charge of breaking the Coke bottle so that they cut their palms to do their oath? Wasn't it Stan that led that? I think it was.
yeah, but I think he also might. But Bill wondered at one time or another if he was actually trying to kill himself of doing that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. A
You
foreshadow of
know,
what's to come in a sense, but
foreshadowing, yes, or is it backshadowing? I mean, by that time,
backshadowing in that case, yeah. There are cool moments of foreshadowing though, like when Georgie goes down to the basement, right? That's a
the
foreshadow of the
turtle.
sewers, the cellar, yeah. And the turtle, yeah, the turtle wax sitting up on the shelf and all that. It's a whole foreshadow of the whole book right there, the whole confrontation in a way. I
Speaking
love
of
foreshadow.
confrontation, you know what I realized when I was went through it this time around? Just how much their fate it wasn't their own to make. I mean, King brings up multiple times how much the characters are not in control, how they feel like they're being slid around on a chessboard. It feels a lot like they're like, oh my God, something's pulling us together, pulling us into place, gravitating each other towards each other. Or they really were like pawns in a game or soldiers in a battle. or a game of Risk against Pennywise.
Hmm. So suggesting that there are certain predestined aspects of one's life that if they allow themselves within the paths of those forces of fate, they can accomplish it. Or, but maybe like Stan, they can choose to bail out. They can choose to pull themselves out of those channels of fate. I don't know. It is an interesting
Maybe.
theme. I didn't think about that while I was reading it at the time. King's touched on this before, like in Cujo. He's touched on fate and chance and all these multiple decisions that affect everybody in a way. Like everything's kind of interconnected in the world, and all the choices we make affect somebody in some indirect way.
Oh yeah, he does do that a lot. I mean, he did that pretty well in Stand, for example.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
Did a
like
lot of
that was basically the final war, the apocalypse, the book of Revelations right there.
this.
Er, but yeah, King does King does like to ask questions about fate and and how much you are in control of your own destiny when he's given the chance. I bet he does that quite a bit in the Dark Tower series. I mean, I've never actually read those books. I tried, but I never got through the
Oh, give
first
it a
one.
try again, Rami. I mean, the whole line of cause a will. But yeah, that
Mm.
right there, he sees life as like these interconnected circles, where certain things come around again and again, but maybe in just a slightly new form. I've noticed that's a way in his thinking a lot.
I know that Gan, his version of God, is also something of a character in those books. So, who maybe, King. Well, authors do tend to play God a lot. I like to imagine myself as sort of like a god when I'm writing my stories.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about another interesting thing about it is this was kind of King's summation of monsters, his interest in monsters and like the subject matter that was came up, probably from The Shining on, you could argue, or after The Stand and on, all the different things he was writing about in those books. And it's almost like these big books, like The Stand, like It, maybe Under the Dome. It's almost like he's, flushing out all that stuff in that book.
Hmm.
And this one, it was monsters, monsters, monsters. And he needed this one penultimate monster in Pennywise to finally, the Eater of Worlds, as it's called,
Hmm.
to
You
finally get him
know,
into the system.
you know, when he says it came about, it came about. Who's on first? Um, it came about because he wanted to write a modern day version of like the Billy Goat's Gruff and the Troll Under
Yeah.
the Bridge, and that's referenced in it several times. That story. He's so I gotta uh,
That was the
um
seed in a way. Yeah. That was part of the seed that grew into this massive thing. Then
and the troll.
intuitively, all these other things grew into it.
Yeah, and the troll kind of represents a sort of, I mean, to a small child, what is a troll? It's probably a synonymous with monster, with their image of monster, big and full of teeth and eats little kids. They probably don't get much more specific than that. It, and its ability to shape shift, to change forms, was very makes it a very versatile monster because it's able to really tap into people's fears. I mean, we see that plenty of times. Mike Hanlon sees a giant bird, and it's not just because he saw Rodin on TV and got a little freaked out by that, but
Right.
it's also because he was pecked as a baby by a crow, and there's some sort of traumatic memory there. Or, I mean, Eddie's leper comes from his fear of getting sick because of his mother or telling him he's delicate his whole life. uh st and seeing those dead boys, um and probably he he well, it could have shown up as anything to Stan, and it would have freaked him out. But um those dead boys probably were a reminder of oh, how easily life it can be lost. Beverly, the blood coming out of the sink and staining her bathroom. If that is straight up a metaphor for female puberty, and I don't need to explain why. And her own fears of growing into a woman,
Yeah.
especially with a father as predatory as she has. You know what's another thing that I love about the book? King takes these digressions throughout the story. I mean, we spend quite a significant amount of time on the death and aftermath of Eddie Corcoran, a classmate of the characters who has a really bad home life, one that Beverly could probably empathize with. He gets beat on regularly by his stepdad, and he spends a lot of nights out of the house, and that leads to his death uh, um, at the hands of it, who shows up as his dead brother, or as well as the creature from the Black Lagoon, when it drags him away. And then there's Patrick Hockstetter, or
His
uh,
scene was
who,
pretty creepy, man. That was a chilling
yeah,
development there.
the movies the movies included Patrick, but they could not go into detail with him, which is a shame because he's such a terrifying and fascinating character. I mean, he's this sociopath, this serial killer in the making, he, who's already taken the life of his little brother, and Pennywise basically snuffs him out before or he can really fulfill his dark promise of becoming a dangerous killer.
What was
Or,
interesting to me about Patrick too is, so it utilizes fears that we have, especially those youthful fears, which are simpler fears, and that power of belief kids have. So it's easier for it to stir that up and draw from it. But Patrick, it was described because of that seed of sociopath and psychosis in him. He saw the
yeah,
world as himself as the only believable thing. Like nothing else was real in his mind. So I almost thought like it would be a far more difficult thing to reach inside of Patrick because of that. Like that would almost be like, how like in the Tommyknockers old guard has that metal plate in his head and it blocks
ah,
the influence of the aliens. Like it almost seemed like it would have been like that in Patrick's psychology. Like almost a metal plate that could block like its influential tendrils in a sense.
I get you, but King found a good way around that. I mean, like when he was a
The
kid,
leeches,
yeah, I guess that was that
his
the
weakness,
leeches
right?
presented a threat to his existence, to his realness, because they had the ability to draw out his life force, what made him real, what made him tick and threaten his realness.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, Rami.
But
And
the
I
thing,
guess it also uses those psychos too, though. Like
mm,
which was a Belch Huggins. Which one of them? What was his name? The one that comes
Henry
Henry. Yeah,
Henry Bowers.
Henry
Henry
Bowers.
Bowers. It used Bowers plenty to in order to go after the kids, but he also used Beverly's dad. He used all the parents really. He
Right.
But back to what I was saying about digressions. King takes these digressions well before we actually really understand what's happening. Um, and and they never feel forced. They never, I mean, it's several chapters before we really start to get the sense of what's happening to the character. And he spends a lot of time just building up Derry and that something bad is happening in it before we actually see Pennywise after the sewer scene
And it
or
makes
after.
sense. It makes sense because, as characters frequently say in the book, that Derry is it, right? Derry is
Yeah,
this character. And so we do need all these details and background things and digressions to help us fully realize this character.
of course they couldn't go into that in the movie,
Yeah,
but
too
that's
darn
why
long.
we're getting that prequel series on Max later, or not later this year, early next year. Or Welcome to Derry. I am so looking forward to seeing how they adapt some of these plot lines because it's going to be taking place mainly in the nine in for those of you who haven't seen the movies, the cycles are done a bit differently. In the movies, they're different times. Like the first cycle takes place in 1989, the second cycle takes place in 2016. But so the cycle, it's mainly going to focus on a cycle taking place in the 1960s, 1962, I believe, but it's going to like hop back and we're going to maybe see the origin of Pennywise. And I hear Bill Skarsgård is coming back as Pennywise, so I'm excited for that.
Oh, yeah. Always looking forward to that. There's one thing, though, Rami, I want to touch on. And this is an important part of the book. In fact, Grady Hendrix called it the heart of the book in a way. It's the infamous sewer scene where Beverly has all of them.
Oh,
And look, it was a
yeah.
jarring scene when I first read it, but I've thought a lot about this scene. This is a scene that stirred a lot of controversy. Some folks accused King of being a pedophile, of writing disgusting pornography. I have multiple reasons why I disagree with these accusations. Um, First of all, tone and style. Okay.
I
The
agree.
tone and style in which King writes this scene, you get a sense he's taking it seriously. There's almost this clinical approach to some degree of how he's writing about it. I don't get a sense of this raunchy, overly graphic depiction.
Yeah, I don't sense any perversion or anything.
Right.
It's meant to be. He even said it was meant to be not romantic or sexual, but more like a bonding moment, moment of
Yeah.
spirituality. Yeah, and
Well,
tastes were different back then. You could get away with a lot more in a horror story than you can now.
I
So,
mean,
but
it's a scene where it's unifying the characters in a sense, and they become strengthened to be able to carry on and find their way out. But I also notice it's a character arc for Beverly, right? Because all of these characters experience a reversal of their fears, and for her experience with her father, sex was this very fearful, violating, frightening thing. And now she experiences in this whole new way where it's this unifying, comforting, strengthening thing. So it's
and she's
completely
allowed to
reversed for
control
her.
it, whereas usually she has no control. So in a
Right,
way,
right.
it's very, I mean, it's still controversial.
Oh
We're
yeah.
not advocating for that in any way, but it is in a
Right.
very strange way, not just spiritual and unifying, but also weirdly feminist. Not that we encourage this sort of thing.
Oh, exactly. The behavior depicted in the book in reality, totally immoral and wrong. We definitely don't encourage it. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I understood what King was trying to do thematically and metaphorically for within the context of this fictional story. Now, whether it worked or not, that's probably forever debatable. I mean, even Stephen King himself at times has said maybe it didn't work. For me, I think it did work, but it still was jarring and kind of weird.
Yeah, in a weird, jarring way. You know, that they actually do reference that in the movies. Beverly's reputation
Yeah.
in is a reference to that. That it's and I'm not sure whether or not it's a good reference, but it does add a layer to her character in the movie that we don't see in the book.
Right. Well, and it's also, as King described, he was trying to, that scene builds a bridge between adulthood and childhood, and
Mm.
sort of sex is sort of that major step that initiates us into adulthood in a sense. I see it more instead of a bridge, I see it as like a braid, the way he leaps back and forth from the time periods. And it's almost like that scene's almost that defining knot that kind of brings them
Well,
together, those stages of life. But
well, well, people have been using sex, especially the first time, as a metaphor for becoming an adult since time immemorial. I mean,
right.
even today, people will say, "I want to become a man" when referring to sex, or when she became a woman. And honestly, I don't. Honestly, a lot more goes into becoming a man or a woman, but I see why that scene was used in that way. Speaking of jumping back between adulthood and childhood, you know
Yeah.
what else I noticed a lot with with the book this go around?
Mm.
How much things echoed one another from the past to the present, or the book's past to present. Like in the past, in 1958, Eddie breaks his arm, and when at the hands of Henry Bowers. And in 1985, when Henry Bowers comes and tries to kill them again, Eddie gets his arm broken while fighting the guy off.
Yeah, that's
And similarly, the Richie Tozier wears glasses throughout his youth. He has contacts as an adult, but later, upon meeting in the park, he loses his contacts and has to use glasses. I can't remember if they were taped up, but he has to use glasses. It's kind of like he how in a weird way fate or whatever was, well, bringing the characters together in 1958 in 1985 is sort of regressing them in a way back to their childhood to make them stronger, and it works. It works.
again. I referenced the Dark Tower, cause a will. That actually relates a lot to it. If you read the Dark Tower, you'll see what I mean. But and
You
King
have
again.
forgotten the face of your father. I
it
act I actually enjoy the Dark Tower movie. I know it has a lot of
was just
haters.
it was too jumbled, man. They were trying to cram too much in that one movie. It didn't work for me. But I've read the
Well,
series, so that's why it didn't work for me.
I'm a sucker for movies like that. I mean, for years, my favorite movie was Van Helsing, he, with Hugh Jackman, and I still love that movie. I also really love League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and so I'm really
Wow,
into
you
those
liked
movies.
that one. I've never seen it, but I hear so many bashing of that movie actually.
It's gained a cult following in the years since. And honest,
Like, didn't
wait, are we
Sean
talking Van
Connery
Helsing,
even
or
didn't he
we're ta-
retire because of that movie too, Sean Connery?
it probably played a factor. But honestly, I think it is an un. It has earned its cult following, and honestly, if you give it a chance, I think you'd enjoy it. In fact, I'm making that your homework assignment. Watch
Oh,
that movie
homework.
again. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
going to be
maybe I'll
doing it
give it a
this
watch
spooky
because I am
season.
curious. I like a lot of Sean Connery's movies. I'll give it a to see how horrible it was. It'd be fun to see. So I probably will give it a watch later. But
Excellent.
anyway, the
Now,
I want to talk also though about just the final battle. And you had touched a little bit on this when we were talking about the void, how these cosmic monsters, you don't really see the full reality of what they are, just what your mind can make of it, because your mind's trying to hide you from the full reality. It's drive you absolutely insane. You get
very cosmic.
yeah, you're getting a sense of that with it, the shape behind the shape. It's described
Mm.
at one point. One of the most common complaints I get when I ask people about this book, and I say, "What'd you think of it?" And they go, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe it ended with a spider." And I read it
Arachnophobia
again.
is shared by like 99% of the population.
Well,
We
but
all freak out about spiders. All I have to do is send a picture of one to my mother and she freaks out.
Yeah, but there was so much more behind that spider, though. There really was. The deadlights, all that, just that huge macroverse behind it that Bill and oh, who was it? Bill gets absorbed into and sees
Richie.
all of that.
Richie
And Richie.
also ends up in
Richie
the
also.
macroverse.
Yeah. There's
And his
so much more to
voices
this
give
monster.
it a headache.
Yeah. So yeah, that's all I bring up is everybody, when I talk to a lot of people, they complain about it was just a spider in the end. And I read it and I went, it wasn't just a spider. There was so much more behind that spider, that shape behind the shape. But and the spider's freaking scary. I've got arachnophobia. I'm terrified of the
We should
creepy little
all be
thing.
afraid of big spiders. Big spiders are terrifying. I mean, have you seen video of a Goliath bird eater spider
Yes.
traipsing around the
Ah,
jungle? And honestly, I gotta wonder, the people who are complaining about the giant spider, if they've seen Shelob, have they seen Aragog from Harry Potter? People are scared of those guys for a reason.
well,
And
and
so
and
it makes sense for it
when
to
I
take the
ask them
form of a
too,
spider.
I say, well, what would you want it to be then? What else should it be? They just go, I don't know. They don't know anything that'd be scarier behind it. So,
Can you blame King for wanting to do something that, even in smaller form, if it crawled up on you, would cause you to scream like a little girl?
well, guys, I'd say that concludes our review of It by Stephen King. Let us know your thoughts in the comments about what you think of this novel. Let us know what it means to you. How did it speak to you specifically when you read this novel for the first time?
Indeed. Have a good weekend. Stay away from sewers.
Does Pennywise the doll have anything to say to the people?
You'll float too. You'll float too. Come
And this
into
is
the sewers. We have ice cream.
Death Ground Reviews, the monster that devours horror, suspense, and all those things the fantastic. I'll see you next time.
And I'm Rami Ungar, wishing you all pleasant nightmares.